The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 9. Completed. Anis is certainly full of beautiful cities. But I have no doubt that the capital of the kingdom of Erebanei, Turkheimak, consecrated to the great god Elaban and his temple, is a must-see for any self-respecting traveler. Despilin's Travels, The Intrepid Volume 16 Part 2. The preparations for the trip made Arian stop mourning his brother's death. She studied everything she could about the cursed city, consulted abundant maps and the old books that contained information about the city of Turkheimak. This kept her busy and avoided sad thoughts. Ferdinand was a great help. He knew Loaf in his younger days. The great wizard let them consult all the information he had about the city and the temple inside the great library of the Council of Magicians. The cursed city was not only of interest to the young woman, she was helped by the faithful Kendeli. In addition to Kush, he was a help to Arian by helping her read and understand the most interesting treatises. The magician was excited. It was a great opportunity to consult hundreds of books, and finally Gosberg, who surprisingly excelled in a prodigious memory and a reading ability that was the envy of others. The trio drove Iria, Ferdinand's apprentice who had the Grand Magician's order to help them with all their requests, crazy. In the end, Arian was able to get an idea of what that great temple consecrated to Elaban was like and the history of the cursed city. The temple was built by the greatest elven masters in gratitude to the god Elaban for his help in times of crisis. The great temple commemorated Elaban's victory over the two demons of the great black abyss that threatened to destroy the earth in the First Era by saving the elves. The temple was elven construction, but most of the city was the hand of man and dwarfs. Unlike other elven kingdoms in Erebanei, the mixture of races and tolerance was the key to the kingdom. The city grew around the temple, which was a sacred precinct since inside it resided the greatest and most powerful jewel of all, the triumph of Elaban. In that city, under the protection of the temple, a great metropolis arose at the end of the era of heroes. They called it the capital of the world. It contained numerous libraries, monasteries, temples, inns, theaters, wizards' towers, and grand palaces. Everyone traveled to the city since the god Elaban showed all his power in that place. The temple healed the sick and the helpless. A place where we can regain hope. There came a time when Elaban was the protector of mortals, and that is why he was the most popular god of all. Elaban received so much praise from mortals that it was said that the other gods were jealous of him, even of his father the great supreme god, and that is why he banished him to live with mortals. The temple was a building of simple construction but of immense dimensions, rectangular in shape with two large doors, one facing north and the other facing south, without windows. On the roof there were large skylights that illuminated the temple in daylight. The interior was simple according to the chronicles: a huge pond in which the great jewel was found. The sick bathed in the waters of the sacred pool and were cured of all their ailments by the power that the jewel conferred on the waters. Around the temple there was a great deal of activity, and in the basement of the temple, these underground rooms were said to be as large as the city itself, where the priests' quarters and other rooms were located. The jewel did not need any protection. No one could steal it. Only a priest of the god Elaban could take it and take it out of the enclosure, but no priest would betray his god. Everything was happiness in that great city until the curse happened and all its inhabitants were condemned, transmitting the curse at night to others. The world was saved by the action of some magicians who created a magic wall as in the First Era. That noble action created the Order of the White Robes, and the damned took refuge in the city, and because of the water it was impossible for them to advance. The currents carried their ships back to the cursed city, and there they stayed. One era ended and another began, the era of the damned. Time passed and the men were gradually approaching the cursed city to plunder. They realized that as long as the sun reigned there was no danger except for the state of the ruins. The relics of the cursed city were very precious. They had to find the quickest way to reach the temple, remove the jewel and return. According to the latest reports of the looters, it was something very affordable, but if for some reason night fell, only eternal damnation awaited them. The calculations were first to arrive at the port at dawn, before noon to enter the temple and be back in the afternoon, a simple plan. They headed for Ulbiana, the great capital that gave the kingdom its name, although many called it by another name, the Jewel of the South, a great city that once paled in comparison to the Cursed City but now had no competition even before the capital of the Black Empire, only the Palace of Heaven more than beat it. The Council of Magi spared no expense. They stayed in the best inn in the city where the nobility of the kingdom stayed. More than one nobleman looked at them with contempt when they entered. Many knew of the help of the mercenaries to their enemies in the north, but the name of Aras commanded too much respect, and also the city was a hotbed of rumors. The state of the king was very delicate and there was no clear successor. Intrigues ran from all corners, but except for Gosberg no one was interested in these rumors. The next morning they embarked. The ship was the best that gold could buy. An elf design that is not very well known ended up in the hands of the captain, the great Labrez, who knew Gosberg and whom he greeted with great joy. Is there anyone who doesn't know little Denka? The captain inherited the ship from his father, and from what was rumored Gosberg had to do with his father gaining command of the ship. The ship was a prodigy, with an elegant figure and 2 large masts. Labrez was used assiduously by the Council of Magicians. They paid very well and traveled all over the world on his strange expeditions. He had sailed all the seas, he had even looked at the coasts of Istamir where those who do not die live. Labrez, once embarked, set sail for the Cursed City. He informed them that in 5 days they would reach their destination and then wait until the morning of the 6th to disembark. He was used to sailing these waters, although the council did not know. Many magicians in a personal capacity paid a lot of gold for Turkheimak's relics. The crossing was calm. At the end of the summer the sea was calm. In addition, the currents pushed the ship towards the Cursed City. Only by sailing in the sunlight and maneuvering correctly could you leave the city. On the 5th day they saw in the background the great towers of Turkheimak. The walls received them. Captain Labrez maneuvered in circles, calculating to arrive just as the first ray of the sun was rising. Arian could not sleep. She was awake watching the silent silhouette of the city. Vanus approached and wrapped the young woman with a blanket. The boat turned and began to sail towards the coast. "We move!" Arian exclaimed. "Within 2 hours with the first rays of the sun, we will arrive at Sit-Mil-List." Sit-Miles. It means cursed place. The Age of the Damned. No priest or theologian succeeded in giving an explanation for why the great God punished the world when the God of evil had been defeated. Some attributed it to the fact that even defeating the God of evil, both Elaban and the inhabitants of the Cursed City had shown too much arrogance, and for that they were punished, of course. Many did not understand these wise explanations and turned against the gods, so at the beginning of the Age of the Damned, religious strife stained the entire earth with blood. In time things calmed down and the cults of the gods survived except one. Since all their priests were persecuted and their temples abandoned, that god was Elaban. From the beginning a rumor arose that his punishment was to live with mortals until the end of time. They arrived at the port. The scale of the construction was gigantic. The harbor alone was almost as large as the city of Tame itself. Huge but simple in design, it consisted of 2 marble pontoons of more than a kilometer. They docked at the outermost end of the port. Captain Labrez did not want to risk the integrity of his ship or his crew for nothing. They disembarked in silence, all carrying their weapons. Aras consulted a map with Kush. Although they had plenty of time, they should not waste it, so they chose the shortest way to reach the temple. The half-orc turned to give the precise orders. "First, we should not separate, or make noise. They say that this place is safe during the day, but I do not want to tempt fate. Remain silent as much as possible. The essential thing is to protect Arian. If any of the group gets lost, his fate will depend on himself. Formation, Gosberg and I in the vanguard. Kush, Arian, Vanus. Behind, Kritus, Ulak, Mulak, Gulak and Sabu. 5 meters away Agnorak covering the rear. Any questions?" No one said anything. Gosberg lit a cigarette and began to walk. At the end of the pier they headed towards a marble arch that indicated the end of the harbor and the beginning of the city. They advanced at a steady but cautious pace. Aris occasionally consulted the map, but the guide was from the Denka, who seemed to orient himself quite well in the abandoned city. Arian was hypnotized. The ruins had her enthralled. There were no animals, the vegetation was sparse, only some weeds grew in the corners, the structures of the buildings were quite well preserved. They vaguely reminded the young woman of Caesarea. She could tell which building was an inn, a store, a temple, or a house. Everything was familiar to him. It seemed that the city had been abruptly abandoned just a few weeks ago, when in fact it had been abandoned for thousands of years. That detail caused him more terror. Something strange inhabited this city, a quiet place in the light of day, not at all the nest of evil as the books described. After 2 hours of walking they relaxed a little and arrived at a large square where a large granite statue was located. Arian approached to observe her better. The statue was a beautiful, muscular young man, with long straight hair, between his hands raised to the sky. He had a sphere in his hands that seemed to be an object with enormous power. "It's wonderful." Arian disobeyed Aris' prohibition to speak, but he did not say anything, who like the rest contemplated the statue in amazement, had never seen anything like it. Elaban, the god of mortals, the protector of the helpless, is the moment in which he delivers the jewel, the triumph of Elaban, to the kingdom of Erebanine. They had heard of the cursed god, but had never seen a representation of him. In the Wizard Council's library they had been removed from all the books in the library. Kush stayed by the young woman's side. In my land Elaban was not forgotten. He was a god of hope, for his youth, his beauty, his character and his determination. Aris dryly spoke again. "It was cursed like this whole city. We must continue. On the way back we will pause here to rest." Aris stopped because in front of them in that square they had 3 large avenues. Which of them would take them to the temple? The half-orc consulted the map and then spoke with Kush and Gosberg. The latter was the one who seemed to have it clearer. According to the Denka the central avenue was the right one, but the magician and the half-orc did not seem very convinced about it. "I know that on the map it indicates the avenue on the right, but that is because the map was not updated. The city was remodeled a little before his misfortune so that the avenue that led to the temple was larger and the number of pilgrims was greater." At the Dinga's speech they resumed the march and advanced at a good pace. A vision bewitched Arian. All the buildings were shadows that appeared before her, indicating the glorious past of the city. They reached a part of the avenue where the buildings were not simple small houses. To their left there was a large grove, to his right appeared a huge building with many floors and windows. "To your left is the Park of Dreams, a place that had been created to recreate your mind and achieve inner peace, and to the right is the House of Healing, where the sick were treated." Arian looked at the Denka, who was the one who spoke of the buildings they were now observing. "How do you know so much about the city?" she asked. "My family was originally from here, so I know a lot about the history of the cursed city." They crossed a simple bridge with a single arch that crossed a river that crossed the city. The river was called Albrisha and its waters were crystal clear and transparent, but there was not a single fish inside. There in the background appeared before them the abandoned temple. The square was completely clear in its center, the temple. They reached the north entrance. They remained in silence contemplating it, more than 50 meters high and more than 20 wide. The doors were locked and they reached his height. Aris spoke. "Here we are, an hour ahead of schedule. We must enter." "Gosberg, please." The Denka silently advanced to the door and placed one of his large ears on the door. "These doors don't have locks. This temple didn't need them either, so." He took his ear out of where it was resting and with both hands pushed the 2 doors in. They moved slowly and the noise of the hinges that creaked from the time in disuse was heard. Gosberg smiled when he saw that he was right and that the interior of the temple was showing before them. "You see, we can enter the temple. Go after me. I don't think it contains traps inside, but you never know." The Denka advanced inside the temple and the rest slowly entered behind him. Arian thought that some artificial lighting would be necessary inside the building, especially because of the gloom that reigned at the entrance. He used the light stone that the king of Demember had given him and Vanus his. They found other doors just as large as the previous ones. These were locked. Critter snorted when he saw that it could not be opened while Gosberg was using his skill with the locks. "Didn't you say that they didn't need to close the temple?" asked the dwarf, quite annoyed. Gosberg smiled. "Well, some precautions don't hurt." The group entered the great hall of the temple and there was no longer any need for light, since it entered from large skylights located in the ceiling. There were no columns, nor any kind of superficial ornament, only a huge rectangular room. In the central part was the circular-shaped pond, in the center of which was a small island with an altar, where the jewel was located. Much larger than his brother's, it shone dimly under the sunlight. Elaban's triumph. They observed the jewel in silence. It was a simple sphere of more than 30 centimeters in diameter. It did not seem much, to be honest. But that strange blue glow made it an object that attracted quite a lot of attention. They advanced until they reached the pond that was quite deep, a little more than 1.5 meters, but the water level was low. It did not reach their heels. Although it was stagnant water, there was no smell of rot. This was where the sick who bathed and were cured thanks to the power of the jewel, said the Denka as he jumped into the pond. "Well, Arian, Sabu go for the jewel next to Gosberg. Kush, Agnorak guard the flank on the left." Arian obeyed and went inside the pond, helped by Sabu. Gosberg had already reached the central island. Agnorak and Kush stood on the other side of the room to protect, but the eyes of the wizard and half-orc landed on the mural in front of them. As Arian reached the little island, Sabu lifted it with his huge arms until he reached the height of the jewel. In ancient times, a waterfall fell over the jewel and the waters were impregnated with its power. Afterwards the priests made incantations and prayers to heal the sick when they bathed in these waters. Only you can take them, if you are really a priest, of course. Arian looked suspiciously at the Dinka. "What if I'm not?" Gosberg smiled. "In short, one has to die of something." Arian looked suspiciously at the Denka, but climbed on a ledge that he had on the altar and raised his right arm, stretching it completely. He had the jewel within his reach. He hesitated for a moment, but his fingers touched it lightly. She felt a small shock when she touched it and then grabbed it tightly and took it off the pedestal. And then, as happened before with her brother's jewel when it was in her hands, the triumph shone again and its light completely flooded the room. They could then see the temple clearly, but the walls were full of engravings and glyphs. At the south entrance there were 2 stairs that descended into the earth located on both sides of the room. "Silis Namarek. What are you saying?" Critters nervously asked the Kendali, who was staring with her yellow eyes at the stairs, and answered the dwarf with a sinister murmur. "That's where the damned sleep." The dwarf looked back at the stairs in terror and gripped his crossbow tightly. While Arian returned with the jewel that was now the same size as his brother's. Arian felt the power of the gem. She knew everything she could do even though she couldn't explain it. The mags were right, it was a very powerful object. "Vanus, come here." Kush called out to the Kendali, who approached the magician. "Use the light stone, please." As always, the Kendali diligently used the stone to illuminate the place. Both the wizard and the half-orc gazed at the mural in rapt order. Agnorak did not like anyone to know that he had a fondness for legends of the First Age, and he knew quite a bit about the subject since in his childhood that dwarf told him stories about the age of the gods during the night. Kush was also an expert on the subject, as in Thissy it was a mandatory subject within the nobility. "That glyph is impossible." Kush was also amazed. "The Drada exist. The legends of my land are true. It does not appear in any book. There is a glyph like it at the entrance of a cave in my homeland." Kush began to take notes in his book like a man possessed. It was the only chance he had to solve an ancient mystery. The Drado were the lost ones. "We're leaving, we must return to the ship." He ordered Aris. Vanus extinguished the light stone. Kush put the book away, and Agnorak continued to look at the glyphs for a few moments before leaving. They left the temple. They could see that behind them was the royal palace, with its slender towers twinkling in the sun. Vanus stood still like a statue. Arian gave her a push. Vanus walks. Silis Milis. Silis Namarek. Arian had to give the Kendali another push. They walked at a frantic pace, so much so that in the end Arian and the Kendali could not follow the rhythm of the mercenaries, until Kritos began to fatigue. His short legs could not keep up with the pace as well. He reluctantly swept away, and to prevent the group from fragmenting, he had to stop. He decided to pause in the square with the great statue, and everyone sat in the shelter of its shadow. They drank and ate some. Arian watched the god. The figure was a total exaggeration, and the jewel, though large, was not the size in which the author had sculpted it. It was 5 or 6 times larger than the size it had been in the temple. The young woman couldn't help but look at the jewel she had in her possession. Now its size was about 8 centimeters. Arian felt something special when he touched it, and in the center of the jewel there was always a faint glow that sizzled. The Kendali took a seat beside him. The young woman put the jewel away. Vanus offered him some water. It's pretty. Yes, but this place is damn lady. I'll just be calm when we get back to the ship. The Kendali continued to observe the avenue in the direction of the temple and the king's palace. It was evident that the Kendali knew something more about this place that the rest did not. Arian looked at the statue again. It no longer seemed beautiful to him. That being now had a somber and threatening tone. It hid a dark secret. Or in the end it was all his imaginations, surely. She smiled unconcerned about her fears. The mission was going better than expected. There were still many hours of sunshine, and soon they would be out of there. The statue began to frighten her. She fixed her attention on the group. Everyone was relaxed sitting eating, but Agnorak got up. A gentle breeze was blowing. The half-orc began to sniff and drew his sword with a serious gesture. What's the matter? Agnorak did not answer, but he saw how Aris and the rest of the orcs began to sniff the air as well and put their hands to their weapons. This place wasn't supposed to be safe during the day, cried one of the orcs. No one answered, as everyone began to take positions inside the fountain that contained the large statue. Kush pushed Arian and the Kendali inside the structure. What's going on? Arian was surprised by the radical turn of events. Stufos! Shouted the dwarf. Can't we escape to the port? Arian asked nervously. The magician was worried. He began to take things out of his pockets and make a kind of putty while muttering nonsensical things. Agnorak was standing still looking at the end of one of the avenues. Finally he answered the young woman. Impossible. They come from all directions. They must use them as slaves. They watch over the city while they sleep. Gosberg was the only one who remained calm. He lit a cigarette. Not even the damned want the souls of those vermin. Cursed the dwarf with great hatred. Everyone was in position, making a circle around the statue and the benches. Smaller statues were distributed around the main one. Don't attack until I order. The Stufos won't attack until they've surrounded us. Aris ordered. What are Stufos? Arian asked in amazement. She had never heard of them. Kritos spat as he tightened his crossbow and described them with a mixture of hatred and sadness. They are not lizards, they are not insects, they are vermin that grow and multiply, destroying everything they find. They are brutal, with long and strong arms, short but powerful legs and sharp teeth like blades, and have poisonous saliva. It is rare, they do not usually attack on open terrain. Aris added, surprised like the rest by this unexpected ambush. Gosberg quit smoking and pulled up his pants nonchalantly to add a crucial detail about the mission's situation. They want to delay us until sunset. Everyone turned pale. It was not such an easy mission. The cursed city would not let them flee with their most precious treasure without standing up. Kritos aimed his crossbow at a still invisible target. My people lived in the Brown Hills, the most beautiful cities built by the dwarfs until they appeared. After a war of 4 generations, they ended our kingdom. A dinner for our people, especially for those of us who swore to protect our house until death, but today I will have some revenge. Critus spat on the ground. Arion wielded his short sword with one hand and with the other he squeezed the bag that had the jewel. He would defend it to the death. The silence was terrifying. Arion looked around and began to hear a murmur. Before them they appeared running along the avenue that led to the temple. Arion could finally see the Stufos. What were they? The young woman could not describe them clearly. They were part lizard, part insect, or both, or perhaps neither. They had a variable height. Although they were usually like a dwarf, they screamed with shrill voices. Their tails were long and oily. They kept it high to run faster. Its skin was brightly colored, where red, green and yellow abounded, although there were violet and blue spots. They carried very strange weapons. Axes, spears, maces of very bizarre designs were recognized, surely made with recycled material. Some of them carried equally strange shields. Behind them they heard the same howls. Another group of the same number attacked them from the port avenue. The two groups gathered in the square and surrounded them. None of the mercenaries backed down. They stood firm. Another pause. The Stufos licked their lips. Kush concentrated more and more on the spell. The orcs drew their short bows. Critus stroked the trigger of the crossbow while his foot did not stop moving. Agnorok remained in a guard position just like Aris. The only ones who seemed calm were the two Denkis, Gosberg watching them with his arms crossed and Sabu sitting cross-legged as he stroked the edge of his great axe. Vanus drew a strange weapon, two short swords joined by chains. Arion was surprised. They are Katroas, weapons of my people. Gosberg gave them to me before leaving for Olbiana. There were no words. Aris put her hand down. Arion stood still watching. She had seen them fight against small groups, but this was a massacre from the first moment. A hell of daggers came out of Gosberg's hands that drove the Stufos back, apart from the fireballs, arrows and bolts. And then the other three came out taking advantage of the coverage of their teammates, running towards their rivals. They were gods of death who mercilessly reaped lives, filling the square with blood. The giant Denka was a fury of nature and the other two half-orcs their faithful squires. In less than 5 minutes the Stufos came out terrified. Aris went after the stragglers. He had to finish off as many as possible to prevent them from retreating. A group of 8 entered the interior of a huge villa and the half-orc went after them, despite Agnorok's warnings. Upon entering the village, the half-orc walked slowly. He did not want to suffer an ambush from those monsters. He advanced very cautiously to make as little noise as possible since the wooden floor creaked with each step he took. He heard a noise behind him. Someone was quickly approaching. He turned on himself. A Stufo was rushing at him. As soon as he could dodge it, he had to drop his sword to be able to repel the attack of the Stufo with his arms and throw it against the wall, leaving the attacker out of combat. But Aris had no chance to pick up his sword. From the ruins appeared 3 other Stufos who grabbed him from behind. One of those creatures bit him with its sharp teeth on the side. He pulled himself out. One from him with a kick to the poor creature's head. The remaining 4 arrived, and although with difficulties between the 6 of them they managed to immobilize him on the ground. Aris tried to let go, but the Stufos were much stronger than they seem. One of them stood up and took the sword of Aris. Smiling he put the edge on the neck of the half-orc. His sentence was clear, it was death. Aris accepted her fate and closed her eyes, assumed the mistake of underestimating the Stufos and entering the building. Soon it wouldn't matter, the suffering would be a memory of the past. They heard a dry crack, the wooden floor gave way, everyone fell into the void. He smiled, at least he would not die at the hands of a disgusting monster. The blow with the ground was terrible. He felt enormous pain in his back. Some pieces of wood hit him on the head. The screams of the Stufos gradually faded away as well as their conscience. He heavily opened his eyes. How long had he been there on the ground? He didn't know it. He got up with difficulty. His whole body hurt. He was dizzy. He touched his head. He was bleeding profusely, but luckily nothing was broken. He opened his eyes, and when he adjusted to the darkness he saw where he was. The fall was terrible. It was a slope of about 10 meters high. Now he was in a kind of basement of the house. Aras searched for his sword in the rubble but did not find it. There were only the corpses of the Stufos. Luckily he had a dagger. With that he would have to fix it. The priority was to first find an exit and then try to reach the port before sunset. He advanced through the basement looking for a ladder or something that would take him outside. The basement was strange. The walls were covered with unknown symbols and figures that seemed to struggle. But Aras did not understand anything since the mural was very worn and covered with moss that covered it almost entirely. In addition, an abundant amount of water came out of its walls. Surely they were filtrations from the river. The cursed city was a very mysterious place. The mercenary advanced through a narrow corridor that led him to a circular room. Here the murals were better preserved. They were undoubtedly elven knights. If I remembered correctly, the elves in the hero wars fought each other. They were said to have power swords that their elite knights brandished. These knights were called the Alisai. But those swords were lost in the bloody war. He came to the conclusion that the place must be a tomb or something related to these knights without a doubt. In the center of the room there was a hollow. It would be the tomb of the tomb, but he did not know since the one versed in these subjects was Kush. He bent down to examine it better and then he could see the mural. Elves fighting elves in the lower pass. This tomb was thousands of years old. Suddenly his sense of smell communicated something else to him. It was fresh air. He saw that at the back of the other room there was a small passageway where at the bottom he could see some light. Surely it was a way to get outside. But before he got up another smell came to him, a rancid smell of dry skin, a smell of Stufo, who jumped on his back and tried to bite him on the neck, but Aras avoided it, although the claws of the Stufo's legs scratched his back. Aras tried to grab his dagger, but the reptiloid with a blow with his tail threw the weapon at him and placed it out of his reach. The Stufo screamed and came to bite him on the shoulder. Aras screamed in pain as he fell to the ground. The Stufo also fell and continued to bite his shoulder. Aras thought, if only I had a sword, and hit the Stufo against the wall, but it continued to bite him. Suddenly he felt his right hand grip the handle of a sword. It was a sword. If it was a sword. He didn't think about it. With a well-aimed blow he burst his head. His sticky blood fell on his aching body. Aras sighed at last. His whole body hurt. The saliva of the Stufo was poisonous. He heard someone calling him from afar, walked down the passageway and saw a crack in the ceiling. He screamed for help. He heard Agnorak's voice. Help! Right here. A large, muscular, hairy arm took his hand and pulled him out of the basement, finally seeing the sunlight. They were Agnorak and Sabu who were in what was left of the building. You're alive. Thank the gods. You have not followed my orders. Agnorak and Sabu did not speak. The great Denka carried Aras in his arms and they set off towards the square covered with hundreds of Stufo's corpses. The sun was going down and his companions had not left the square. Aras rested for a moment. Arian and the Kendali hastily healed his wounds and gave him a drink. Aras did not know what the girl had but noticed that she was much better and the effect of the poison had disappeared. Why are you here? Gosberg ordered to hold the position and repel the attacks until you appeared. Commented Arian. It's crazy. Aras got up instantly and went to Gosberg and Agnorak. You disobeyed orders. Gosberg smiled for a moment. You were the first not to do your own bidding. But we do not gain by arguing anything. We must return to the port before nightfall. Kush watched as the sun descended in the west. time running out. In addition, they have attacked us in waves over and over again from the Port Avenue, so it was not safe to advance. Now it seems that they are withdrawing. Kritos informed Aris apologetically. Gosberg began to walk toward the avenue. They leave because it is going to get dark. There were no more words. Everyone began to run with all their might. Gosberg was the fastest. He opened the group, finishing off the Stufos who were lagging behind. Sabu took the two girls and carried them on his shoulders so that he could move forward quickly. But now the harbor avenue seemed to be an eternal length and darkness began to cover the cursed city. Gosberg stopped in its tracks. Aris stopped. "What's wrong?" asked the half-orc. "Troll shit. We won't have time." The Denka cursed. From where they were, you could see the temple and the castle. Vanas turned and for the first time his cat-like pupils became completely round. "They are coming for us," Gosberg sentenced. "The damned!" exclaimed the Kendali, terrified. Arian looked at the Kendali seriously. "Move forward, I'll stay." He ordered the Denka to turn around, then Gosberg stood still and looked toward the center of the city. "Hurry, Carrot!" shouted Aris. The orc-blooded men fell silent. Agnorok also advanced into the interior of the city, but Aris with a gesture stopped him. "No, you accompany the rest, it's an order." "It's crazy. Agnorok, I don't have to remind you who has the highest rank in the group." The half-orc did not answer and began to run with the rest of the group towards the port, leaving only Aris and the Denka on the avenue, while night fell on the cursed city. Aris watched in silence as her companions disappeared. "Invoking an old orc tradition is not like you," the Denka announced sarcastically. Gosberg lit a cigar and smoked it quietly as he took a seat on the floor. Aris was silent. He was used to the Denka not taking anything seriously. While smoking with astonishing tranquility, Gosberg tossed a strange coin in the air with a playful air, and spoke with a certain solemnity. "The cursed were the inhabitants of this city when it was condemned by the gods. They roam the city every night, waiting for some unwary person to stay after dark. Then they feed on the blood of the poor victim who becomes a cursed man like them." Aris knew that if Gosberg played with the coin it meant he was nervous, and that happened very rarely. The Denka put the coin away as he heard a rhythmic murmur coming from the center of the city. In a few seconds the murmurs were transformed into rhythmic chants. "They'll be here in a few minutes." And then the half-orc took a deep breath. Aris looked at his new sword. It was simple, not as ornate as his. But it was exquisitely workmanship. What impressed him was that the blade was made of black steel. "Nice sword. An elf leaf from the first era," commented the Denka. "I found her in the basement." "Well, what are you waiting for?" When an orc warrior claims an old ritual of suicidal warfare, the least one expects is to see him before he is devoured by a mob of spawn. Aris smiled as he listened as the volume of the chants grew louder and louder. The damned approached. With the sword he cut the inside of his right wrist. An abundant amount of blood gushed out of the wound. Aris walked in a straight line, tracing with his blood a line that crossed the entire width of the avenue. "No enemy will cross this line." "Fantastic. But you should have said it in orc," Gosberg pointed out. "What is the Hurrikarat?" "It is an old orc tradition. When a group of orcs is outnumbered and the defeat is clear, the two best warriors stay to cover the rest of the group in their retreat." The one who answered was Sabu with a much more affable voice than it seemed. Arian was surprised. "Do you know how to speak?" the big Denka didn't answer and concentrated on running as much as possible. The weight was tense. Aris cut her left wrist, sucked a little blood and then spat it on the floor. Decast. I had only asked for an orcish tradition. I don't want to end up in eternal darkness if I die. If they catch you, something worse than death awaits you. That is not going to happen. Silver dots began to appear and flashed on the avenue. The murmur was thunderous. Aris smiled. Now he could see their blackened bodies, their muscles limp and dry, their mouths full of thick white foam, with sharp yellow teeth. Gosberg began to throw daggers with his deadly aim. The victim, when receiving the blow, disappeared, leaving a cloud of ashes that covered the atmosphere of the avenue. The damned advanced steadily despite the rain of daggers. They were like a tide flooding the avenue. They climbed the walls of the buildings, watching them with those cold eyes. They reached the line marked by Aris, who began to attack them quickly. Soon a cloud of ash was covered around them. It was impossible. The tide was getting more and more intense. Containing them was impossible. Aris and the Dinka joined their backs. We must withdraw, Aris shouted, while dodging the attacks of the damned ones who tried to grab him. I don't know how. They have blocked our way. We are totally surrounded. Aris swallowed hard. It was true. The avenue that led to the port was overflowing with the damned. They were sentenced again. He watched the edge of his new sword. It would never be one of them. He felt something strange happening in Gosberg. He felt a heat that was not normal. The Denka for the first time in a long time had run out of daggers. He had the emergency knife left. But the damned ones didn't attack. They just kept their distance, watching them with their silver eyes. Shouldn't they go after us? Gosberg did not answer. His eyes began to glow blue, but Aris, being behind him, could not see him. That was what contained the condemned, the fear of that blue color. The silence was total. They noticed a new murmur, someone who was advancing along the avenue of the temple. The damned moved away as he passed. After a minute he reached the circle. Before them a cursed man appeared, but he was different from the others. He was much taller than the others. His musculature was better preserved than those of the others. His eyes had red irises without pupils. A silver 5-point crown and a red gem in the middle stood out above all things. Who is it? The king of the damned. The elven king of Erebanii, who vanquished the demons of the black abyss. Now he is doomed for all eternity. The king smiled at the sight of them, but did not speak. Aris lowered his sword. He was seeing a legend still doomed, but the king's gesture changed to an expression of disgust. His red eyes flashed. Supernaturally. He raised his hand and with the index finger of his right hand pointed to the sword, and then extended his arm and opened and closed his hand. I think you want you to hand him the sword. The Denka was astonished by the events. Aris smiled and raised the sword he grabbed with both hands, maintaining a guard posture. Well, let him come and get it. Aris mumbled. That being seemed to understand the challenge on the part of Aris, and one of the cursed ones seemed to hand him another sword that he placed in his hand. Gosberg relaxed to light a cigarette. Aris seemed annoyed by this gesture. I think he's challenging you to a duel. Aris did not speak and advanced slowly until he reached the height of the king of the damned. The circle widened. The rest of the condemned watched the duel. The king of the damned began the fight with a strong sword to the half-orc's face, who blocked it with a simple gesture by raising his sword. The king reacted to launch a sweep and knock down the half-orc, who luckily jumped and dodged the blow again. Aris decided to separate himself a little from his rival. Aris began to breathe slowly. Nerves were useless. He had to keep a cool head, have a calm pulse, raise the sword with temperance and then observe the opponent and lower the sword. You are crazy! Gosberg shouted. Aris had observed this gesture in Agnorok when they trained. It was a risky action, but the king advanced on his defenseless rival and threw a deadly blow, but when the blow impacted he only found the air. His rival was not there. The only thing he saw was how his head was thrown into the air before transforming into ash that was scattered through the air. The damned stood motionless as if they saw an illusion. Aris stood for a moment looking at his silver eyes. It was a look of surprise and terror. Aris, let's go before they recover from the fright. The Denka pushed the half-orc in the shoulder and they began to run, pushing the cursed paralyzed and leaving that circle of damned. Agnorok was at the beginning of the port, the rest had embarked half an hour ago. The captain was nervous, he wanted to leave now. But he didn't because the orcs put a blade on his neck. Hopes were dwindling, Kush was now in charge. We must set sail. Agnorok is back. The half-orc stood still, not wanting to board. Captain, let's set sail now. Agnorok. Big-headed. The sailors began to cast off, Agnorok leaping onto the deck of the ship. Here they come. Kritos shouted as he loaded his crossbow. Agnorok picked up a bow just like the orcs. Kush began to search through his pockets, took out some ingredients and began to knead them while reciting nonsensical words. Gosberg ran faster than Aris. Little by little cursed men who seemed to have recovered from the loss of their king arrived and advanced like a tide. The couple was covered by a rain of arrows. The Denka came to the ship with a great leap and without losing his breath he took a bow and began to shoot. The ship was moving away while the dock was filled with cursed people. Agnorok protected the position, but it was impossible. These beings advanced with great speed to Aris. Agnorok climbed to the stern of the ship and began to shoot faster. The Kendali administered the arrows just like Gosberg, until Sabu threw the anchor like a hammer that finished off a large group of damned people, that caused a moment of relief for Aris to gain a small distance and began to run again towards the boat. Set aside, everyone! The magician screamed as he had never done before. He was strange, very swollen, his cheeks were totally red, he was about to explode. Everyone moved away. The magician let loose a fart of meaningless phrases until he was totally hoarse. He opened his mouth until his jaw was almost dislodged and a large ball of fire came out that rose in the sky illuminating the cursed city. The fire was transformed into a dragon that rose in the sky to plummet on the pier and explode, while Aris jumped and grabbed Agnorok's hand and the ship sped out of the dock. The fall of Aris was not good, it broke part of the deck. The fireball had set fire to the sails of the mast closest to the stern. And the sailors applied themselves to putting out the fire. Aris was crying in pain. Agnorok had a splinter stuck in his arm that he removed with some difficulty. Arian bandaged her wound and then went to care for Aris who was lying unconscious. Kush stood up utterly exhausted and watched Gosberg as he watched the fire spread over the cursed city. Was it a lie? Everything we have been told about the curse was a lie. Gosberg lit a cigarette. As always he took a puff and the smoke that came out of his mouth played around him. He smiled and seemed to be in a good mood. The wall of the white robes was never necessary. It is a vile deception on the part of some greedy mags. With the Stufos as slaves, they can use them to leave the city but they don't. The damned are condemned to watch only one thing. The mage turned and watched Arian who was working with the help of the Kendali to heal the wounded. The duel. Gosberg sat down and closed his eyes to rest. The magician stared at the fire. Tripulia was a farce from the beginning. What's the point of all this? He was the only one who was awake with Agnorok who despite the wounds was cleaning his sword. He had observed just before Kush launched the fire dragon how the Denka had faintly shone his eyes with that blue color. Agnorok got up and went to the magician, with whom he hugged each other, congratulating themselves on having managed to get out alive. Then they stood watching the fire as they walked away. The half-orc muttered something as he spat into the sea a mixture of blood, ash, and saliva. The gods play with us.